officially start this webinar and just say how very honored I am to be with you, Ronnie, David, and Pat. And I've known you all for a long time. I remember Pat, in the 80s, the wonderful work you had done on seeds and how the petrochemical companies were buying up seeds at that time and creating these hybrids that wouldn't regenerate. And yeah, David, we've been together in the Forum on Globalization. And Ronnie, you've also been attending some of those meetings. So it's a great honor to be here with you today. And I'm really happy to be able to introduce Alex Jensen, who's been working with us for decades and who is far more well-versed in localization than I am. I have an experiential foundation of this reality of living in a more localized way. Alex is our walking library. And I do want to tell everyone that if you want to do a PhD in localization, come to our website, and the films and the books and the articles, almost all of them have been collected by you, Alex. And I'm deeply grateful for your work. And I want to say too that Alex has farmed high up in the Altiplano of Peru. He's farmed in Ladakh or Little Tibet, in Italy, around the world. So hands-on as well as a great intellectual asset. And I'm so grateful for your work. So thank you for being willing to chair this webinar.
Well, thank you, Helen. That was extremely gracious of you. I'm happy to welcome everyone to this webinar today on the theme of from corporate control to local regeneration. Really, so much of what I've learned has been inspired by, in part, our three speakers tonight, David Korten, Pat Mooney, and Ronnie Cummins. Before we get started, I just want to do a little housekeeping. The first point for everyone tuning in is that if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A window rather than in the chat box. The chat box is the place for making comments and introducing yourself and where you're from. But in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, you can enter a question, and please also state where you're from, if you don't mind, so that we can sort of introduce you to the speakers when we share your question. Okay, so I think with that, I will make a very brief introduction of our three speakers, and then I'll turn it over to them to have 10 minutes each to share their thoughts, and then we'll come back for some comments and a discussion with Helena, and that will be followed by a Q&A session where we can dive into your questions. So with that, let me introduce our speakers. The first is David Korten, co-founder and board chair of Yes Magazine, president of the Living Economies Forum, and author of numerous books, including very well-known, very influential When Corporations Rule the World and Agenda for a New Economy. Next speaker is Pat Mooney. Pat is a founder of the Etc. Group and most recently lead author of the Long Food Movement Report, which came out along with the International Panel of Experts on Food Systems. Pat received the Right Livelihood Award in 1985 for his work defending peasants and their seeds. So Pat, thank you as well for being here. And finally, Ronnie Cummins, who is joining us from Mexico, I understand, is a lifetime activist and co-founder of the Organic Consumers Association and Regeneration International. His books are Grassroots Rising, A Call to Action on Climate, Food, Farming, and a Green New Deal, and The Truth About COVID-19. Cummins is also co-director of the Via Organica Network in Mexico. So welcome to all of you, and I think we can proceed from here. David, if you would like to go first with your presentation, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Alex. I very much appreciate the opportunity to join in this celebration of World Localization Day, along with so many friends and colleagues out there. Now, I like to begin my conversations about localization with a simple question. What is the purpose of the economy? Now, if it is to grow the financial fortunes of the world's richest billionaires so they can escape from a dying Earth and fly off to start a colony on the already dead planet of Mars, then our corporate controlled economy is doing a pretty good job. But if the purpose of the economy is to secure the well-being of all people on a living Earth, then the corporate controlled global economy is a monumental failure, and giving control to profit-maximizing transnational corporations is an act of collective suicidal insanity. So that kind of marks the territory. We have been conditioned by a deeply flawed economic theory to believe that money is wealth, and that if we just focus on growing money, we eventually will all enjoy effortless luxury with no need to work. Now, it turns out that if you look closely, you may notice that money is nothing but a number. And it has value only because we accept it in exchange for things that are of real value. Money has no inherent meaning, value, or existence outside the human mind. We cannot eat, drink, or breathe it. It will not warm us on a cold night, nor stabilize the climate. It can buy only what others produce through their labor and offer for sale. Governments create it with a computer keystroke. Now, those who joined us for this session are likely all here because you have noticed that we humans are living beings. We are born of and nurtured by a living Earth. And our well-being depends on Earth's well-being. This simple and obvious truth is the foundation on which a valid economics must rest. The essence is captured by the insight of our African ancestors, known to most non-Africans as Ubuntu, which translates, I am because you are. Now, as the leading edge of science now confirms, life depends on community. Yet we choose to structure and manage the global economy based on the theories of an egonomics that assumes humans are individualistic financial beings living on a dead rock whose well-being depends on competing to maximize individual financial return. That misguided choice explains why, to use the technical term, we are in deep shit. Now, in its fullest meaning, Ubuntu acknowledges the individual's dependence on the whole of life. I am because we are. Turn that into an actionable principle, and we realize that I do best when we all do well. This leads me from asking, how can I make a difference, to how can we make a difference? We all lose when it's about my money. We all win when it's about our well-being. Now, our most intimate experience with the interdependence of life is our own body, the vessel of our consciousness and the instrument of our agency. Each of our bodies, yours and mine, is composed of 30 to 40 trillion living cells, supported by some 39 trillion microbial cells we know as bacteria, viruses, and fungi, all engaged in constant, ever-adapting exchange of oxygen, nutrients, water, and information. These trillions of cells are supported by 100,000 miles of blood vessels. That's enough to reach around Earth 4 times, that provide these cells a continuous supply of needed inputs while collecting and disposing of their waste. Together, these cells continuously, intelligently adapt to changes in the variety and timing of our food consumption and the temperature and quality of the water we drink and the air we breathe. Mostly, these cells self-organize locally through processes of which our central conscious mind has no awareness, let alone control. The level of local, intelligent, cooperative decision-making this miracle requires defies imagination. And science is still a very long way from figuring out how it all works, but it is increasingly evident that it does. So then jump to Earth. Earth is a vastly larger and more complex living organism. Yet like any multi-celled organism, Earth survives as a living being only so long as its countless individual organisms self-organize locally to create and maintain the conditions of climate, pure water and air, fertile soil, and countless other conditions on which Earth's community of life, including humans, depends. And life does all of this through locally adaptive processes with no controlling central authority. This suggests that localization is not just a good idea essential to improving our quality of life. It is essential to our very survival as living beings. We humans must now learn to organize ourselves from the bottom up as living communities continuously adapting to the ever-changing needs and opportunities of the living Earth community to which we all belong. As a now interdependent global choice-making species, humans likely will always need multiple levels of self-governance. But the necessary role of the upper levels of governance, national and global, is to support local self-reliance, prevent one community from exploiting its neighbors, and assure that the benefits of productive labor flow to those who provide the labor. This brings us to the issue of ownership. For power to reside within a self-reliant community that directs the benefits of useful labor to the local people who provide that labor, the ownership of local assets must reside with those people, with the community. Part of the return of local business to local owners comes from the business's contributions to the well-being of the community in which the owner lives. The owners also enjoy the well-earned respect of their neighbors who appreciate the services that their businesses provide. Local owners naturally manage their businesses to secure the long-term well-being of the community on which their future and that of their children depends. Cooperation for long-term well-being is win-win for everyone. When you put that power instead in the hands of transnational corporations, all those incentives for the community well-being disappear. Economies of scale are entirely possible with community-rooted cooperative ownership, as demonstrated by the Mondragon cooperatives in Mondragon, Spain, the Triodos Bank in the Netherlands, and the Ace and True Value hardware stores in the United States. Earth's future and ours depends on achieving a rapid transition from a global economy controlled by profit-maximizing transnational corporations to a world of locally rooted, well-being maximizing living communities. I developed this further in a paper on ecological civilization you can find on my website, davidkorten.org. So back over to the rest of you. To Alex.
Great, thank you so much, David. I think we can now go on to Pat Mooney. Pat, are you ready?
Sure, yes. Thanks,
Okay,
Alex.
great.
And thanks, Alex, and thanks, David, for that brilliant context. That's a very wide, broad view of the economy in our world, which I think is the key way to look at what we're talking about this evening. I'm going to dig down into one part of that, and it is a small part in one way, but it's also a very critical part as well, and that is our food system and the vital necessity for localization and local communities to be at the center of that food system and for themselves and for those around them. I've been a part of a 2-year project that's just coming to an end now. We had about 40 odd people from around the world and from every kind of background you can imagine, but all related to the food system, whether they're indigenous peoples or peasant farmers or fisher folk or academics or political organizers who have been dealing with food movements for decades often. And we were trying to imagine not what kind of food system we would like to have, but what our choices were between the food system that's being imposed upon us by the industrial food chain and the food system which we think will actually keep people alive and nurtured and culturally thriving in the decades ahead, where we go through a whole series of crises, of which the pandemic is one of them. As we started our work on analyzing what could be done in the future, what kind of system could be possible for ourselves, the pandemic broke, and everything went out the window in terms of our understanding of how much could change and how quickly. I guess at one level, we probably all thought that rapid change was possible. We've all thought about tipping points and ways in which we can move systems more rapidly than might happen otherwise in history. But there we are at a tipping point where the geopolitics are changing all of a sudden. The United States very prominently there, but not just the United States. At a time in history where things that we thought were economically simply incomprehensible suddenly become extremely easy to do. Where major changes, ways of thinking about things, ways of controlling corporations, even as shallow as they are in some ways, are still possible in other ways and could be done. So the world kind of opened up and we began to imagine more creatively about the political steps that could be taken to strengthen local communities, to support their work in restructuring the food system away from the industrial food chain. And the model was very clear for us because of the pandemic again, where we saw what happens when you depend upon long supply chains for health security. Where you have a vaccine that may require as many as 1,000 different ingredients coming from 70 different companies and almost as many countries around the world, trying to work together or work for each other for their own profits to produce vaccines and then not get them to almost all of the people of the world and get them clumsily to other people in the world. The failures of that supply chain and the political failures of our system have been just brilliantly exposed over the last many months. And when we then looked at what industry was proposing for the future of our food system, and there's a World Food Systems Summit coming up later this year in the United Nations, when governments are addressing the issue of that summit, corporations are saying, well, trust us to take care of you. We have the supply chains, we have the technologies that will get us through climate change, biodiversity loss, other health crises and so on. We'll take care of it. Well, that's obviously not possible. And it's been rather easy for us to argue that in the current industrial food chain, which now takes up about 75% of the world's water and most of the rest of the world's resources, including at least 75% of the world's land, arable land, that industrial food chain is actually only feeding about 30% of the world's people and doing that rather badly and doing it at an enormous cost to our health and to our environment. The real costs of the industrial food chain are around $12 trillion per year, of which the taxpayer sees a part of that as in the retail stores, but pays for much more of it outside of that, or at least has the burden of it outside of that, of the retail prices. It's a very failed system. And that's an industrial food chain that's been dominating policy, if not the food on the table, but dominating government policy around food and agriculture for my lifetime, for the last almost 75 years. And while they've been dominating that and calling for subsidies and about $750 billion in subsidies per year, while they've been doing that, they've shown to us that they can't scale up. They take all the resources, the lion's share of the world's resources and monies, and they produce very little food that really is helpful to people and nutritious for people. Alternatively, and it was clear to us as we examined the way ahead, the kind of future that is being built now by local communities and is possible, it is that those local communities together are managing to produce food that nurtures about 70% of the world's people. They're doing it with, again, far less than 30% of the world's basic resources in terms of land and water. And while much more needs to be done, it's not a perfect system that needs more support. It's doing that despite the industrial food chain. It is growing and strengthening despite all the pressures that are against it. And we need to, if we want to survive the future, the climate crises that's around us, the biodiversity loss that's overwhelming us, if we want to get through that and keep our world safe in the decades ahead, then we really got to be strengthening local markets. We've got to be strengthening close food production as much as is humanly possible everywhere in the world. That's got to be our priority. Everything else is secondary to the need to actually build those local communities. And it was interesting for us because we honestly weren't sure where we would end up in this discussion when we began it 2 years ago as a group around the world, trying to sort out the future of the food system. But it became finally the central conclusion that we had is that we need to change that system in support of local production around the world and local communities. And beyond that, and I'm sure David and Ronnie can speak to this better than I can, we recognize that the food movement as we see it is simply one movement among many. And if at the local level, especially, we're going to try to build a different system and maintain a different system, then the food movement has to work with the health movement, has to work with the anti-globalization movement, has to work with those who are whose core basis from labor movements. It has to work with human rights movements around the world. We've all got to be working together, those fighting on climate grounds, those who are going to be in Glasgow this year fighting at the summit there, those who are going to be in China fighting for biodiversity there at global conferences, have to be recognizing that they also have to be supporting local communities and that they have to be doing that in a coordinated kind of way. So our conclusion in the Long Food Movement report, and it's available again at the etc. group website, etcgroup.org, and it's at the IPES Food website as well. The conclusion of the report is that we need to have this cross-sectoral collaboration of major movements around the world, and that collaboration has got to be strengthening in every way possible local communities. I think that's probably all I should say at this stage. I'm looking forward to the conversation and looking forward to hearing what Ronnie has to say.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Pat. I posted a link to a couple of the reports from the etc. group in the chat, so I hope everyone looks at those. Really important stuff. Okay, Ronnie, let's move over to you, please. If you're ready with your presentation, the floor is yours.
Indeed. Well, the last 15 months, 16 months have been horrible in many ways, but there are some hopeful signs out there. One of them for me is that this term regeneration, which a group of us started talking about in September 2014 at the big climate march in New York City, Vandana Shiva, Andre Lowe, Hans Herren, a whole group of us, Rodale Institute. We had a press conference at that giant climate march, and we were trying to get across the point that it wasn't just alternative energy and energy conservation that was going to get us out of the climate crisis, that we had to change our food, farming, and land use practices across the world. And I'm now happy to say that, well, 7 years later, regeneration is, the hottest topic in the organic and natural circles. Is talked about all over the place. So I think that regenerating our food, farming, and land use practices is extremely important. As COVID-19 has shown us, regenerating our health is also important. But we're up against some people who control the world, these 1,500 large corporations and billionaires, and we've seen them in action here. since the advent of COVID-19. I mean, first of all, they tried to tell us, oh, this had nothing to do with crazed science, you know, that just because people were manipulating viruses in a lab in Wuhan, a joint effort of the US and China, you know, they published papers talking about how they could make bat viruses infect humans. Well, don't worry, it couldn't have been a lab release, because the scientists tell us that every lab in the world experimenting with genetic engineering or this type of souping up viruses, as they say, they're never going to have an accident. Don't worry about it. You know, what I have seen this year is the enormous power of Big Pharma and Silicon Valley. When you put these two elites in charge of global policy, you've got some real problems on your hand. And we're up against a major problem. But a couple of good things happened this year. All over the world, organic food sales went up considerably. People cooked more at home. They improved their cooking skills. They you know, tried to tie into local food systems, food hubs, and so on. And in many cases were successful. Everywhere I go, there's a food hub, there's local activity happening. So I think I'm encouraged by the fact that there's 1 million local communities across the world. And in almost every one of these communities, there are developments of local food systems. There are people exchanging information about natural health. There are people talking about how they don't want the elites to be calling all the shots. So I think it's a scary time that we're in. It's pretty clear at this point that we should have thought a little more deeply about genetic engineering, for one thing. I remember back in 1992 and 93, we were having meetings in Washington, D.C. of a group called the Biotechnology Working Group. And we were talking about how genetically engineered food was right on the horizon and we better get ready for it. Monsanto and the rest intended to roll this out. But there were also some scientists from Cambridge who later got involved in the Cambridge Working Group. And they warned us too that genetic engineering of food and crops, yes, is very hazardous and it's unregulated and we better organize against this. But they also told us we got to look at genetically engineering viruses and bacteria and microorganisms. And most of us from the food movement, we didn't listen that carefully to that. We didn't take it quite that seriously. We didn't listen to what some of the people were saying about chemical and biological warfare treaties, how important they are, and so on and so forth. I think now we're waking up to that, and we're going to have to deal with that. And we're up against people now extremely powerful. I mean, when Bill Gates says that organics are a threat to humankind because it's not sustainable, it uses up too much land, and that they got a better idea, lab food, you know, fake meat and all the rest, fake milk, and they are putting billions of dollars behind this and billions of dollars behind, you know, attacking relocalization of food systems. We have some formidable enemies here, but I also think I've always been optimistic. I think there's some good signs. And I think one thing I've noticed, I live half the time in rural America. There's only about 14% of the population in the US that live in rural America. And, you know, Trump and the conservatives, you know, win most of the elections. They don't win in northern Minnesota where I live in a rural area, but they win in most rural counties across the US. But one thing you notice at the local level is it doesn't matter if people held their nose and voted for Biden or if they held their nose and voted for Trump. When you start talking about local food and health, you know, and education and our kids and our grandkids, we can work together, and people are working together. And I think the media doesn't cover this, but it's really quite possible. We formed a coalition with the Sunrise Movement in 2019 called Farmers and Ranchers for a Green New Deal. And a lot of people told us, you can't do this. You know, most ranchers are Republicans, you know, and they're not ever going to support the Green New Deal. But I mean, when we started reaching out to people and explaining what our concept of the Green New Deal was, we ended up with 20,000 farmers and ranchers in this network. And they may disagree on some issues, you know, but they are willing to work together on the issues that really matter. So I think that rural-urban conflict can be reduced. The fear in society can be reduced. We can go forward, but we're going to have to build a coalition that comes from the grassroots up. These million local communities that we live in one of them, all of us, and the work we do there is extremely important. If we're going to have a regenerative food and farming and land use system, there's 4 components that I talk about in my book from last year, Grassroots Rising. First of all, we have to have the innovation and the good work of the food producers. And what we've learned in Regeneration International is that all over the world, farmers and ranchers and land managers and indigenous people, they've already figured out what to do. They already have all the solutions that we need. The problem in many cases is that no one outside of their local area has heard of their incredible innovations or the breakthroughs that they've made. So our job as regenerators is to identify these best practices at the local level around the world and start to publicize them more. But of course, this isn't enough to just have the good practices that exist, even if we can publicize them. We need consumer awareness and demand for these products. We need for people to stop buying processed food that's poisoning them in the United States. I mean, you look at our chronic disease statistics in the United States, 62% of the American public right now have one chronic disease. 42% have 2 or more. These are the people who died from this biological trigger, SARS-CoV-2. You know, for the most part, it was people whose health had been damaged from eating the kind of food that corporate America lays out, and the polluted environment and the stress that we live under. So if we're going to get away from processed food, we've got to learn how to buy more locally and buy fresh and improve our cooking skills and connect with the farmers and other consumers in our area. I think there's signs that is starting to happen, but we have to deal with these people who tell us that the human body, our immune systems aren't good enough. You know, this is what they're telling us right now. Our human bodies, our immune systems aren't good enough. We got to have these genetically engineered vaccines, and there'll be more and more of these messenger RNA vaccines. And no use to pay attention to the sorry state of public health, because people are obese. They're gonna be more and more obese people. Cancer, heart disease, you know, which are the top killers, are going to continue. This is the way it is, but this is not the way it is. And I think we can move forward around this. It's not that easy, though. When you see a lot of well-meaning people in the food movement are vegans, right? They have fallen for this message from Silicon Valley and from Bill Gates that lab meat is the future, and that we've got to get rid of animal husbandry across the world and get onto these genetically engineered fake meats and dairy products and so on. But when I bring up to a lot of my vegan friends, I was a vegetarian for 40 years, I have to admit. I wasn't a vegan, but I was a vegetarian. When you bring up, well, a billion people across the world are herds people, you know, and take care of animals, And the land they live on, it's very difficult to grow crops without irrigation. And what are you saying these billion people should do? Should they go down to their local McDonald's and buy an Impossible Burger? I guess Burger King is where you'd have to go these days to get one for now. And what you find out is that so many people, they've never thought about this. They've never thought about, like what Pat said, that most of the food in the world is produced by small farmers and herds people, you know, with very few resources. And so even though we have to put our efforts, and this is what I do personally in north central Mexico and in northern Minnesota, even though we have to put a priority on local efforts, we got to build a global solidarity, a consciousness, sort of like the consciousness we had when I got active in the 60s around Vietnam, you know, around South Africa. You know, it's like most of the problems in the world that we have today are going to be solved in the global South, or they're not going to get solved. The climate crisis, we're not going to sequester enough carbon in the global North to make a difference. The global South is the turning point. The global South is the turning point for whether we're going to use our resources wisely, regeneratively, organically, or not. And too many people think that internationalism or international solidarity, oh, that's old hat, you know. It's like, what does it matter what's going on in Mexico or Central America, you know, or the Caribbean? Well, it matters a lot, you know. And the right-wing politicians in Europe and the US who have cashed in on the immigration crisis, you know, no one is standing up and saying what needs to be said was that the reason people migrate from their home territories, at least I know this in Central America and Mexico, where I've lived half my life, is because they can't make a living on the land anymore, you know, and because these drug gangs that are facilitated by this crazed drug war are running rampant. And if we want people to, you know, not rush up to the borders, paying the cartels thousands of dollars to smuggle them up there, we have to help them create prosperity where they live, you know? And then what people will see is people don't want to leave their homes in Africa. They don't want to leave their families. They don't want to leave their families in Mexico or Central America. But if they have no choice, they will do that. So let's look at things. Let's work locally, but let's look at the global picture and let's start to consciously practice solidarity every chance we get. So that's my 2 cents for today.
Great. Thank you, Ronnie. Well, thanks to all three of our speakers for thought-provoking and very brief comments compared to the amazing amount of work they've done over the years. I encourage you to, all of you participating, to check out some of their works, which I've shared just a few in the chat, some books and articles. But now I'd like to turn it over to Helena Norberg-Hodge, Director of Local Futures, for a few sort of reflections and comments on what you've heard. Helena.
Thank you. I'm so honored and delighted to have the three of you here. I think that it's very clear from what all three of you are saying that we must move away from this corporate system, and that in doing so, we need to come back to that localized, earth-based, local economy that we actually in Local Futures have been talking about and promoting for 45 years. And we have always done so from a global perspective. So I completely agree with you, Ronnie. It's vital that there be a better understanding in the global North of what's actually going on in the global South. That would help us move beyond some of the political correctness I was talking about earlier. They're getting caught up in the politics of identity instead of getting caught up in the politics of what's happening to our soil, to our water, to our bodies, to our communities. And I want to be sure that everyone who's listening knows about Via Campesina. I've been raising awareness about them again since the early 90s. They are the biggest social movement in the world, with about 200 million small farmers. And yet most people haven't heard of them because they have been trying to raise awareness about the fact that it's been at the level of trade treaties that corporations have been taking over our government and our worldview. Our science, our media, our education has been polluted by big money. And so what we're talking about here today, you have to actively look for to find, because the dominant sin, the dominant narrative that's spreading even through the social media is one that you have to be skeptical of. And in that connection, I want to say to Ronnie especially that I'm quite nervous of how regenerative has been catching on with the big guys. So Nestle is now proud of being regenerative. So it's very much about what happened to sustainable, what happened to organic. And so I would argue, not only do we need a very holistic view in terms of understanding better the realities in the so-called global south or third world, but we also need to be arguing always from a very holistic, systemic position. And that's where, when it comes to food systems, we really must be talking about more localized systems. And really for us, what localization is about, it's not about acting locally. It's about helping to rebuild local systems of production and consumption. And as I say, very much informed by what's going on globally. And so now around food, I would argue, please try to use the language of more localized and diversified systems. And that's where it also becomes vital that we demonstrate that animals have almost always, almost everywhere, been part of those localized systems. And every farmer knows that animal dung is absolutely the best thing for the soil. They know intuitively that when it comes to climate change and everything else, keeping the soil healthy, absorbing the water, providing the viral and bacterial reality that soil needs, that plants need, that our bodies need, animals as part of that production system make not only a lot of sense, but in many cases are necessary. And so most peasant farmers and most families, they've had, even when they were sometimes vegetarian, they will have had a goat or a cow that eats waste and that provides that valuable dung and also meat when it's appropriate. So that bigger picture, more holistic, more diversified, and around food, if we could please talk about more localized, more diversified systems. And I think to hear David, to hear you talk about money being nothing but a figment of our imagination, nothing but an idea. And what we're allowing is for this idea to accumulate in the hands of fewer and fewer people. Fewer and fewer people, and it's through a corporate trajectory. It's not through a trajectory of individuals alone. They're acting as part of this corporate system. And actually this idea that we need to remember that corporations are persons is actually very unhelpful. We need to remember that corporations are empires that are more powerful than nation states. That's what we need to remember. And working with those structures which have been not only legitimized, but which are now ordering our governments through ISDS treaties, investor-state dispute settlements, to not do anything that will in any way inhibit their profit-making activities. That's what our governments are signing in black and white. We promise we will not do anything to reduce your profit-making activities in our country. If we do, you can take us to court, to a kangaroo court that nobody hears about. So I'm so happy to have the three of you as colleagues and comrades in understanding not only the need to say no to the continued escalation in the globalizing corporate competitive rat race, as David said, heading to an already dead planet to fight over some minerals, and to embrace instead a path towards the earth, towards sustaining life, and understanding that that path needs to fundamentally be a decentralizing, localizing path towards diversified systems. We are, as we go on this journey, I'm thrilled, as you can imagine, that there is now an awakened respect for indigenous culture. And it is the indigenous cultures that in many cases, like the Aboriginal cultures here in Australia, sustain themselves and life on this rather dry continent for 40,000 or more years. That's still under dispute. But there is so much to learn from those traditional, localized indigenous cultures. And that's, of course, what my book, Ancient Futures, is about. What can we learn of the basic principles to take to our future? And I would argue that one of the most important that we haven't discussed is the preeminence of experiential knowledge. I experience this vital necessity for experiential knowledge, whole embodied knowledge, in order to understand and deal with the plants, with the animals, with the water and the soil on which you depend. What this modern system, with the help of these global traders, going back to enclosures and slavery, what they've done is to demonize experiential knowledge to the point of non-existence. You can't even say, oh, the sun is shining today. You have to cite someone who has said that in a book, because you're not allowed to have any, there's no respect for experiential knowledge. And yeah, anyway, that's dismissed as anecdotal. And this is fundamental also to us understanding what has happened to science. This basic principle of testing hypotheses is, of course, something that people did for thousands upon thousands of years. And as we know, acupuncture, with books going back 10,000 years, has been about testing hypotheses, and they've arrived at knowledge about certain herbs and practices. So we do have a very big task questioning this big system with a big picture, while also including in that big picture the reality, you were saying, Ronnie, of how many people were saying in the movements, 100 million or something around the world. But when you look at Via Campesina, we're talking about 200 million people. So we're actually a part of a much, much bigger movement than we realized. Again, because the enclosed system of knowledge, the way knowledge has been shaped by big money, we don't get to hear about this. And this is also why, Ronnie Cummins, David Korten, Pat Mooney should all be household names, at least in North America. This is part of our task, is how can we get this wisdom out, and how can we show how this wisdom that the three of you are delivering is supporting and strengthening what indigenous grandmothers still know, many of them, and are also trying to say. They are also not known. But I do feel empowered and hopeful that ultimately life will win. The realities of life will keep speaking the truth. And whether we have to see even more illness, even more social breakdown before life breaks through with the honest truth that we are one, that we are interconnected, that life is one, that spiritual truth and that real truth will out. And it is a question of different movements coming together, also, as you were saying. So thank you so much. And thank you, Alex, for helping to moderate today.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Helena. So do you, at this point, Helena, can I ask, do you want to have a short discussion amongst the speakers and you, or shall we move into the questions from the audience?
Well, I do hope I didn't take too long there. I will be able to see later, because this is my problem. I would love to hear first, maybe, if Pat, David, or Ronnie, if you have questions of one another or comments that you would like to make. or comments about what I said also.
I have, can I, is it okay for me to say something?
Yes.
Please, yeah.
Okay, it's Pat.
Please.
Just to say that I'm agreeing with what I'm hearing. I've got two mixed feelings about what you were just saying, Helena, and going back to something that David said as well. One is with Helena, I absolutely agree that, I mean, it's shocked me to realize that, we're all of the same age among us, and our generation is the first generation in the history of the world that is losing more knowledge than is gained. We've lost about half of the indigenous languages of this planet. And with that, we've lost a vast amount of knowledge about how this planet operates, and we can't get that back when it's gone. But at the same time as that knowledge has been disappearing, we've moved away from money to the, and this is something that David was saying, from money to the control of information. So the power of the corporations now is not because they've got money, it's because they've got data, and they manipulate that data, and they have data that isn't available to others, including to governments. So it's their capture of information that gives them enormous power now. I think it was an economist some decades ago who said that gold is just a big bubble, a 6,000-year-old bubble, but a bubble, and cryptocurrencies are just a bubble. But the big data in the food system, big data in the health system, big data in the energy system is what guides the major corporations now, the asset management companies now, who are actually the ones who are calling the shots. They've got the real power. And that's a different kind of power than we've experienced in the past. And it's more frightening because of that. And I worry about who will finally control that data. And of course, it has its weaknesses. It's shallow. It's got all kinds of problems to it, but it gives them enormous power over what even governments can exercise. And we see now, in the case of the food system, that we can't talk about Cargill and Monsanto or BASF or Bayer or Syngenta. We've really got to talk about BlackRock and Vanguard and State Street and the major asset management companies that have, collectively, BlackRock has $9 trillion in assets by itself. These companies exercise power because they have the information. That when companies sit around a table, behind them are the asset management companies who can see all the cards all the players have. They have all the information, and they're determining how we're going to manage climate change, how we're going to manage health crises, how we're going to manage food change systems and data and everything else. So it's a changed power environment from what we've seen in the past.
Well, I just want to say, at first you said it's not because they have money, it's because they have information, but of course they have money and information. And as David was pointing out, the money is nothing but information. And we're allowing them to put those little zeros behind their, dollar signs because we are ignorant about it. And so here we are in a situation where, as I see it, the most important activism is what I call big picture activism, is to get this bigger picture out as quickly as possible. The solution is that we would be lobbying our governments, and there's no point starting till we have a movement, but the movements coming together across social, environmental, spiritual, and every other type of movement, because every single person who cares about anything, be it, poverty or dolphins or whatever, needs to be awake to what's happening. When those movements come together, we will be insisting that we're going to be sitting around the table with our governments, insisting that these giants that most people don't even know the names of, who are running the world and running our worldview, are going to be regulated. And they're going to be regulated very rapidly, basically out of existence. That's the way that things could proceed peacefully, because they don't actually own the armies. Our supposed representatives do. The people that call themselves our representatives as governments do. And I honestly believe that the biggest reason we are in this horrific situation is because of ignorance. I see, as someone else was also saying, countless well-intentioned people supporting various aspects of this system without understanding, what they're doing. So I think there is, and as Ronnie was saying too, I think I've seen, all around the world, that left, right have become meaningless categories, and that we have to be so careful we don't get caught up in that theater, and that we start talking about what people care about, their health, their children's future. And food is, again, we're throughout this whole World Localization Day, you'll see we have this major focus on food, because that is where the action is, and that's where the most important action and movement building can happen, bringing together left and right. But I mustn't go on too much.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. David, we haven't heard from you since the outset. Do you want to chime in here?
I would. I think we need to be very conscious of one of the things that is distinctive to humans. We're a very unusual species, which doesn't mean we should be in control, but so far as I'm aware, we're the only species that creates our reality in our mind. So we see the world according to the belief system that we are taught to frame as part of our education. And the discussion here, it really strikes me, brings us back to our education system. That we're dealing with three fundamentally different views of reality. The one that I think most of us share is the living systems reality, the living earth, life organizing to create and maintain the conditions of its own existence, thereby seeing a living earth as the basis of our being, and recognizing that we are killing earth and that there are no winners on a dead earth, which creates a universal perspective of, we need to get together and work this out. But also part of that is a recognition that we cannot control nature. We are ultimately dependent on nature. Now, put that in the frame of our education system. One of our major frames in education is economics. And we now teach it to students at all levels. And in economics, we teach them that money is value. Money is where the future lies. If we just make enough money, we can solve all our other problems. Then we have the courses, our science courses, which are mainly about mechanism and technology. And the answers are machines, ignoring the very characteristics of life that our very existence depends on. Now, if we look at the people who are in charge, the ones that control the money, and I think, Pat, you make a very important point about the information as also being part of the control now. But this world, this control by the monetarians, they're of two different schools. You've got the Koch brothers, who are purely predatory, and their world is about money and exploitation of nature to make money. And that's one group. They are the, in a sense, the ultimate psychopaths. But then you've got the Bill Gates. And I don't know that Bill Gates' goal is to control the world. And he's giving away much of his money, but he is representative of the technocratic perspective, the machine world view, and the view that whatever our problems are, technology can solve them. All with absolutely not the slightest understanding of life or biology as we now understand it, true ecology. And I emphasize this because of the sense that, in one way, we could describe what we're dealing with as a battle of mindsets. The living mindset the technocratic mindset and the purely financial mindset. So I just bring it back to that I think we have to keep that in mind, because if we can help our fellow humans understand that these are, quite different ways of seeing the world, they have hugely different implications. And we are destroying ourselves because of the defectiveness of our mindsets, including what we actually teach in our most advanced educational courses.
I would just like to add there again, though, that I would argue that money is a technology and it's a very efficient tool. And so for me, it divides into the technocratic and the life-based. And I think there again, we need to be looking at experiential knowledge versus second-hand knowledge and the wisdom of ancient languages, the ancient Tibetan dialect that I speak. You cannot speak with authority about something you haven't experienced. So it's not possible to say, my fingernail is broken and in China it is like this. You can't use the same verb. You have to say, when you talk about China, it is said that it is supposedly like this. That comes into the language. And so I think we've had this historical development towards being trained to see the world through a mindset that has actually been imposed on us by the winners. So the winners from the beginnings of this system we're talking about were these white men who had very overtly racist, misogynist, anti-nature values, and who started, enclosing people, driving them away from the land, away from life-based ways of living into cities, while enslaving people, driving them away from their self-reliance and their knowledge of nature. And then came a narrative about progress. This is good for you. You're so much better off. So I'm thinking I would love us to have a discussion with some of these indigenous leaders. And I wish we had all been on the same webinar together last night with Camila Moreno, who's a colleague of ours from Brazil, who's been at all the climate negotiations and has witnessed how this carbon narrative has been imposed by corporations to create this narrow profit-making focus on climate, to reduce it all to this tradable commodity. But sorry, Ronnie, did you also want to comment?
Well, I think that's so true about traditional indigenous knowledge and the knowledge of the small farmers and herds people. I'm spending a large part of my time right now working on, it's the most exciting project I've ever worked on in 50 years in the organic movement. And it's utilizing desert plants, agaves and mesquite or nitrogen fixing trees in a manner that sequesters tons of carbon, restores the environment and the water cycle, produces low-cost feed for livestock, and this was discovered by some small farmers about 45 minutes from here 12 years ago. They figured out if you ferment the leaves of the agave, which have never been used in recorded history, you change the composition of the leaves of the agave in such a way that animals, it's good food for animals. And so some scientists in a lab didn't discover this. I mean, I searched all the scientific literature after I discovered this by visiting that farm 2.5 years ago. There was nothing about this. There's nothing in the climate. I had meetings all day today with climate people in Mexico who are looking at the fact that if this system, this traditional system, is deployed on several percent of the lands in Mexico, they will be able to cancel out the current emissions in the country. It's been right in front of our eyes, these plants, these traditions, but because it was poor people who worshiped, who felt that cactus and agave and mesquite were valuable, no one, none of the advanced PhD scientists have ever paid any attention to that. And they're starting to now, because they're seeing the, we're not going to get out of this climate crisis in arid and semi-arid areas without thinking outside the box. And this is it, you know.
I would just warn against scaling this up too much. I'm worried about single solutions that then get, that's also where I wanted to say to David, talking about efficiencies of scale, that our take on efficiencies of scale is that when it comes to that direct fishery, farming, forestry relationship with life, the efficiency of scale is actually the smaller, the better. And the more eyes and hands per acre, the better. We've allowed fossil fuels to appear cheap, and we are driving up the price of labor. And this is one of the first things that we'd have to shift in the policy system, is to shift the subsidies to actually support human labor, to render these ecosystems healthy again, even in many traditional communities, is going to require so much love and care and attention to the detail. So, yeah. Alex, I think we should open up to questions now.
Yeah, we're surprisingly running near to the end of this session. So let's, if that's okay with the speakers, let's transition over to some of the questions that have come in from participants. So I hope we can get to all these, and I apologize in advance if we cannot, but I will start with one that came in from someone named Ash Tang. And Ash writes, how can we hold governments accountable for accepting sizable donations from huge corporations that then go on to influence government policy that are favorable to these corporations and not to the people? What can we do on top of localization at a grassroots level to make sure our governmental systems move away from this type of corruption? Great question. And certainly one that we could spend a whole conference on by itself, but who would like to take that?
Or should we group a few of them together and then try to answer if we're short of time?
Yeah.
Whichever you think.
Good idea. I think that's a good idea, yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's great. Earlier in the chat, let's see if I can find it. There was a comment that was really a question from someone called Lisa Reynolds. And this was to David, but it's a bit related to that last point. You know, thank you for your presentation. I read When Corporations Rule the World in the 90s, thinking finally someone gets it better than the rest of us. I happen to think, I felt the same way actually when I read your book, Dave. That was almost 25 years ago. What will it take for us to transform into a fair economy? Chris Hedges basically feels that we're doomed, or he has a basically doomed prognosis, and that I'm guessing this is what Lisa meant, that we should all move into monastic-like communities, sort of retreat and do our best to survive the collapse while living our values. So government corruption, and what will it take to transform into a fair economy? I see those as quite related.
Well, those kind of fall in my territory. You know, the first one in terms of corporate contributions is recognizing that if money is speech, then the only people who can speak are the rich. And it's a total violation of democracy. And I think we're beginning to see this conversation actually gain some real foothold, that we've got to get big money out of politics or we have no democracy. And if we, of course, recognize that corporations are not persons, they are legal fictions, and the vote political power should reside with people, one person, one vote. We've got a lot of work to do on that. Now, about moving into monastic communities, you know, we cannot go back to life in isolated tribes living off individual pieces of land. There are too many of us now. We have to organize. We have to organize as local communities, but within a framework, a much larger global framework of interaction. Most of us need to live in cities that have high concentrations of population, but are organized in a way that we can live totally without automobiles, which is something I learned when we lived in New York City. It's one of those cities that's basically designed to live without automobiles. And this, this requires organizing as a now global species, but as a collection of local communities, of urban spaces that are connected to their rural areas, where we recognize that, we need the rural areas for the food, for nature, for water, for all the things that are essential to our life. But we have to organize it around living systems and around the health of nature. So it becomes not just rethinking our technology, but a fundamental rethinking of our infrastructure and how we organize together to use the land. So no, there's no way we can all survive as monastic communities, but we can organize as rural urban communities that organize together around local self-reliance, but also around organizing to secure material sufficiency for everyone, along with spiritual abundance. And we haven't even talked about the spiritual side of this, but those things that give us true sense of human satisfaction and well-being, which are not material, but which are spiritual. They involve love. They involve caring for life. They involve music and play and all the things that really bring us joy. So that would be my response to those questions.
That's great. Pat, I wonder if you would want to chime in there too. I mean, when you said that, I think you said BlackRock holds some $9 trillion of assets or something, and these kinds of powers are in the world determining the shape of our lives to such an extent. I tend to feel hopeless and powerless when I hear that. I mean, what can we do about the BlackRocks? And that relates to a question from Anya that came in that was asking, given how little time there is and how urgent the crises are, what are the most important pressure points for change?
Well, there's two things there, I think. One is that in our conversations, we've been moving a bit away from the need for strengthening local communities and localization of our actions. And that is already for much of the world, including urban and peri-urban communities around the world, a viable, strong way to move. And even in dense urban cities, that there's community that can be built that can fight against things and build better for their food and health systems and so on as well. So I don't give up on any of those parts, and I do think those strategies can happen despite BlackRock, although BlackRock makes it harder. But I think we're at a point where there's a crisis that we're seeing in the World Economic Forum, and a crisis for them, for the bad guys. The World Economic Forum, I think, feels that they have a problem on their hands, which is that there's a cascading series of crises coming up ahead. They're getting the blame for a lot of it. Capitalism is getting the blame for a lot of that, as they should, and they haven't come through in the promises they made in the past. The things that Ronnie and I can both talk about, what was being said in the 1980s about genetically modified crops or biotechnology. None of those things that they promised us did happen finally. Much worse things happened. And we can look at a series of failures by industry over the last several decades and their promises and what's been achieved. They know that. All they can say now is we've got technologies that in the future will solve these problems. So and we're the only ones who can take the risks and have got the deep pockets to do it. You governments don't want to take those risks. Just get out of our way, clear away the regulatory systems for us to go ahead and move. They're trying to make that argument, and they're making it under a guise, which I think is quite scary, but is very visible, which is that they're saying, let's forget about governments and one nation, one vote in the UN General Assembly and so on. That doesn't work. What we need to do is have multi-stakeholder dialogues. We need to all sit around to get the table together, industry with governments, and even civil society can be at the table. And the three groups will together figure these things out, frankly and honestly with each other, to see how we can work our way forward. So they want to share the burden of guilt of what's happened. And then they want to really, what they do want to do is say to governments, clear the deck for us, and we will try to solve these problems, but give us the guise of multi-stakeholderism. Civil society is at the table because it's basically store-bought civil society. It's what they've paid for to come to the table. And they're there for decoration. And that's got to change too. But it's being seen. That proposal is what we saw in the COVAX strategies around the world, with the World Health Organization, around the rolling out of the vaccines. And I'm sure Ronnie can talk more about that. It's what we see being proposed around the World Food Summit. They're calling for a multi-stakeholder system, which moves away from governments entirely. Again, will just a group of us sit around the table and decide together? A small group of us. We're seeing that in the International Telecommunications Union. Is being proposed literally in every place around the world. We saw a few weeks ago the Secretary General of the United Nations looking at the issue of big data, saying after talking with governments, who governments said we've got to, as governments, decide how to regulate big data. And the Secretary General turned around and said, I want to create a multi-stakeholder group that can help solve us and guide us on what regulations we should actually have and put in place. And then the companies, and you know which companies they are in terms of the big data companies, Google and Amazon and so on, said, okay, let's have a multi-stakeholder group, and don't worry, we'll pay for it. We'll foot the bill for this multi-stakeholder strategy. They'll set the regulatory system for the world. So the control, again, is going back to, again, the BlackRock, State Streets, and so on, who are fronting Amazon and Google and the rest. And so that's, but it's there. We are seeing it. Civil society is moving against those strategies around the world. And I think that the crises we've experienced show us that civil society with governments can actually move and make major changes. But let's not lose sight of the need for local actions as well, regardless of whatever happens on State Street or in Washington, D.C.
Well, I love that you say that, Pat, because that's exactly what we're trying to encourage people to do, to create those localized structures, which has, as David was also saying, well, you weren't saying exactly that, but what we're saying is that also brings enormous spiritual wins. It has huge benefits for well-being, which in turn engenders more strength and optimism and the ability to work together to make change. So changing the I to a we by building those genuinely interdependent, localized structures. And it comes back to economic in the sense that we are sharing and caring and building those localized food systems, which are essential for our health and well-being. But at the same time, raise awareness about exactly this takeover at the global level of corporations dominating and shaping the agenda. It's that simple. And it started with these PPPs, public-private partnerships. As governments were handing over power to global corporations and getting poorer and poorer, relatively poorer than the global corporation, they're going to them and saying, can we please have a public-private partnership? And you'll help us build the roads, and we're rolling out those highways for you so you can transport things even more back and forth across the world. But sorry, Ronnie, did you want to comment on that too?
No, I just, like the United States is a perfect example. We have 517,000 elected and appointed public officials. And we only have, all the discussion is about these 535 people and the president in Washington, D.C. It's like we can take power at the local level, not only economically and in terms of educating people. We can change local government in the U.S. and around the world, and we're going to have to do this. And I think the crisis is so severe that it's going to escalate beyond local control. It's going to affect cities and counties and regions, and eventually we're going to straighten all this out. I'm very confident we can win this battle because we have truth on our side, and we also have there's an intangible force out there that is inspiring us, no matter what country we're in. And people all see that this great reset that they're talking about, this is not the only great reset we're going to have is the relocalization of the economy and rebuilding our spiritual and ethical power so that we can face up to these relative handful of billionaires and technocrats who are going to destroy us all if we don't act.
There's another distinction that I'd like to bring in here. Business is essential. Transnational corporations are not. And part of this future is the essential need to break up the corporate monopolies, and those businesses that actually have useful roles, convert them into some kind of local cooperative worker ownership. So I just want to throw that in terms of the way we think about the business piece, and recognizing that when we talk about government, business, and civil society, in a human society, civil society is the foundation. And government should be accountable to civil society, and business should be an integral part of civil society.
Great. Thank you. Well, we have about 4 minutes left only, unfortunately. And so I will throw one more question out there. And if we could just, whoever wants to answer, just briefly go for it, even though, again, it could be a whole conference in itself. Mark from Boston asks, what are the greatest challenges faced by small local farmers seeking to feed their families and communities while making a living at it? What pressures do they face from the industrial agriculture system? So Pat, I know at Sitter Group made a really important report, Who Will Feed Us, which has been a real touchstone for the food sovereignty movement for years. And what you said in your comments earlier, the report could almost have also been titled Who Always Fed Us and Who Will Feed Us Post-COVID. But what do you say to Mark?
I think the biggest threat are international trade rules and international subsidies that work against smallholder producers. I'm not against subsidies for agriculture when they're needed, but they really aren't going to the right places. So we need to recognize that we are in a crisis for the rest of this century. We're going through a series of crises. It's not just one or another. It's going to be a crowd of them coming along. In that crisis, we need to have sort of local emergency laws where local governments can say, in this crisis, we suspend international contracts, we suspend land grabs, we suspend intellectual property rights, we suspend the subsidies and how they're being handled, and we must put all of our energy into strengthening local food systems and local production and making sure that people get fed. And that can be done as crisis legislation. It should be backed up by an international treaty, but it can be established at the local level, then adopted in national legislation, and then become an international treaty.
Fabulous, Pat. That's, exactly.
So, okay, we have just a couple of minutes left. So I just wanted to give a chance to any of the speakers to get in a last word, if you'd like. And anyone?
Well, I'd just throw in here that, what we're talking about is not small adjustments in a basically functional system. Our future depends on deep transformation of a failed system, which is why I'm quite taken with the discussions that frame it in terms of a civilizational transformation. And starting with a recognition that even those things that we call civilizations are mostly not civilized. So we're in the process of imagining a civil civilization and how we could possibly get there from where we are at the moment.
As a panel of the pale, the male, and the stale, I'm not sure I should say this, but Pachamama would be doing just fine if it weren't for all the macho papas.
I love it.
And we're so honored to have such great allies in men who are not macho papas. So, you know, who are in total support of Pachamama. And we have to be really careful that we don't tar everyone with the same brush. And that we don't tar generally. You know, this is a time where we've just got to come together. We're up against a type of machine, a machine driven by narrow focused, so narrow, such a narrow focus that it is blindness. You know, that's how I see it. It's just people running afraid. You know, when Exxon was there and separate from Mobil, there were two CEOs, but they're promoting this mega merging. That means everybody's job is on the line and everyone is running scared. So we just got to take a deep breath, slow down, and think about how to move forward in this time of crisis.
Great. Well, thank you so much, everyone. Thanks especially to our three distinguished speakers, giants in their fields and inspiration for all of us for a number of decades. So thank you for your life work and for being here with us, sharing some of your valuable time. And thanks to all of our participants from all over the world who joined in.
I'd also like to say to Ronnie, David, and Pat that we will be sure to share your contributions beyond this live webinar. You know, we have recorded it, and so hopefully many more people will hear what you said today. Thank you so, so much.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Good luck to us all.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. Good night, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are.
Good.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Alex.